All right. I want to talk about a new topic, but a related topic, and it's a question for Stefan. Can you talk about the issue of fires and solar panels at home? You've mentioned this to me a couple times, and I've read a couple articles. I'm curious. I almost never hear it mentioned. I was talking to a good friend of mine last week, and who's pretty savvy in general, and he hadn't heard it mentioned. So can you just talk about this problem that we never hear about?
Yeah, so problem is of course relative because I don't think it's a very common occurrence, similar to Tesla electric vehicles are not burning all the time. It happens, but it's relatively rare. So, when you have a solar roof installation, the problem is that these solar cells are constantly generating electricity as soon as light shines on them. That's how they work. That's a photoelectric effect, and you can't really shut them off. There is no off button or off switch that you can pull and trigger and make them not do that. So even in an emergency, when either there's a fire at the home, or even if the electric installation creates a fire, the problem is that you have a sort of power generating unit on the roof that you cannot shut off completely. And so, if the firefighters arrive, sometimes the best option is actually to let the roof burn in a controlled manner, because you cannot just, put water on the roof and then have firefighters rescue people inside the house or something. So that complicates things a lot. So there are there's sort of, in experts circles, there are manuals that mention this kind of hazard, that you have electric shock hazard when you put water or foam on the roof of a burning house with the solar installation. So it complicates things. And it can also start fires. I actually don't have a good statistic on about how often that happens, but it's something to consider when you're planning your roof with a home installation with a rooftop solar installation. That's definitely something to think about and be aware of.
Yeah, well, in California, they are unfortunately planning what everyone's roof should have with new homes because they're mandating solar panels, or at least that's the last I heard on the subject. And it's just remarkable how this doesn't get discussed. I mean, it's a serious thing to increase a fire hazard in your home, and yet and the cause and effect is fairly straightforward, and yet it's just not mentioned. It's not considered an important story, and particularly, it's even more dangerous if you don't know about it, and yet there's just no interest in the actual downsides of these because these technologies are so overwhelmingly means of attacking fossil fuels and passing certain policies versus actually accomplishing something good. And there are other things with solar panels. You hear of, or maybe you don't hear of enough, but people who have solar panels often they will have animals nesting under the panels in different ways, and it'll cause all sorts of noise and all sorts of issues there. And it's just not mentioned. Of course, then there's just the maintenance and the amount of time that people are spending. I remember I had lunch in the last year with somebody who's a very successful finance person, and he's telling me about solar panels and he had installed them and he was disappointed with the performance, but then he talks about going to dust them and all this time he's spending and all this. And I'm just thinking, you have so much earning power and yet you're wasting so much time with these stupid solar panels. I mean, this is one of the great things about decentralized power. We don't have to do the maintenance on our power systems, and we don't have to have all of these difficulties. Like we don't have to worry about the fires involved in generating power, which tend to be a bigger deal than when you're dealing with all kinds of power. You're more likely to have different kinds of accidents. So it can be good to be away from them, and yet there's none of these benefits are mentioned. So it's the existing power system. The grid has tons and tons of advantages, and when we're talking about different kinds of alternatives, certainly when you're encouraging individuals to adopt them, let alone mandating that they adopt them, there needs to be honesty, not just this fantasy of oh the everything is wonderful. I think I remember Bill McKibben had some line, and I cannot, he said there's no such thing as like a solar spill. It's just a sunny day or something like that. Well, like, okay, but under the right circumstances, you can, you can, with a sunny day, you can, that can cause a very destructive fire. That could cause your house to burn down. That could cause more people to get injured than would have otherwise gotten injured. Also, this reminds me, Stefan, I think you had a point. We got to go into this. There's somebody who's been writing me for the past year or so, an interesting guy named Mark Rausch. And writings, writing and sort of trolling, there's a little bit of overlap because he's just been kind of writing publicly. But I do want to get back to him on some of his claims. And his basic idea is that there is um, basically that ethanol got screwed over in some way that prevented it from being the leading energy source of civilization. And that if only it hadn't been for some sort of conspiracy a long time ago, then ethanol would just be everywhere. But I think he had some line, Stefan, correct me on this, but it's something like, if we spill ethanol, then it's just happy seals or something like that. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, right. So yeah, he's really big on how gasoline and lead gasoline of the past has been really toxic and killing so many people. And you got oil spills and wars over oil in the Middle East and so on. So this is this big narrative. And then he says, well, with ethanol, you have none of these problems. You have domestic production, and also it's super clean. And if you spill ethanol into, the ocean or the river or what, all you get is a happy seal. And then he has this, this seal on a beach, being happy. And this is of course not true, because we know that ethanol kills animals, and it gets, you know if you have a tanker full of crude oil or tanker full of ethanol, I guess the ethanol will kill the seal actually faster.
Interesting. That would be good to good to look into. For the new version of the book, I'm going to do some more research on ethanol because I'm and biofuels in general. I'm curious. They are, in some ways, they've become less popular, at, but there are. I know, for instance, in the realm of jet fuel, there are talks of a low carbon jet fuel, and we can do this using biofuels. With biofuels, there's just this inherent point that I've never heard refuted, which is just that it just tends to be very resource intensive to grow calories, like to grow calories of any kind, but particularly to grow food calories. And then with most of these biofuels, you're essentially growing food and then using it for fuel. uh, and you're growing food and then processing the food and then using it for fuel, versus with oil what you're doing is you're taking a naturally plentiful concentrated stored source of energy, and you didn't have to grow anything, and you didn't have to process it. I mean, you have to process it some, but it's already processed into quite a potent form. And it's different than corn, right? There's a lot more distance between corn and fuel than between crude oil and fuel. So just we'll talk about this more in the future, but I'm just curious, Stefan, is that still your impression, or is there some good argument they have against the resource, the resource intensity of growing food and then transforming it into machine calories?
Yeah, I think it's still like just the process. It's the material intensity on one hand, but also like a growing season, right? If you have to wait 3 months until the raw material reappears, and then you maybe can plant it once or twice a year, that already in itself is a big cost factor. And of course, you need agricultural land for that. Maybe not exactly the same quality, but often exactly the same quality. I think it's like 40% of corn production in the United States goes into these biofuels. So that's a lot of agricultural land that's used. It wouldn't have to be used otherwise. And so there are a lot of factors that just inherently make this more expensive. And I don't think there's a good fix for that. Maybe GMO crops and better fertilizer, something like that, better technology can improve a bit on that. But they are just underlying processes that make it really expensive.
Good, good point. One more thought on that. but yeah, so it's a great point about the growing seasons, which had not been top of mind to me at all. But one broader point, which is the difference between the potential and the actual. And this is a very broad point that Ayn Rand talks about a lot in different contexts. But in the context of energy and economics, it's just important to recognize there's a difference between the actual ability to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy in all of its needed forms versus the claimed potential ability to do it. And part of what happens with an actual ability is that you've solved all of these problems. There are just so many things that, let's say, the oil industry had to solve to reliably deliver jet fuel so that we can fly around all over the place. And we have no idea that, there's just so many things that went into that and that were difficult, and just different kinds of systems and logistics and processes and coordination. I mean, who knows what went into it, but the idea is they figured it out. They have a working system. But then when somebody talks about a potential, they don't have to have a working system, and they don't have to have engaged with all these problems. They just have to have a kind of, a couple of plausible sounding things like, oh, there was a conspiracy and these oil people had influence in this legislature. And, Joe Bob is powering his truck with this stuff. And, this other truck could be converted this way. And there's an experiment in a lab with this kind of thing. But it's not actualized, and because it's not actualized, it hasn't there are bound to be innumerable problems that we as onlookers can have really no idea of the extent of. And we know that they can often be deal breakers because most ideas are bad. I mean, most ideas are not workable in the sense of being economically competitive. So our protection against bad potential ideas, which is most statements of potential tend to be bad compared to what the actual thing is. Our protection against it is what Ayn Rand called the separation of state and economics. So the idea that different people can have different ideas about what's the most efficient way for people to produce things, but people are free to compete. And if you have an idea, then you can try to outcompete somebody, but you can't impose your bad potential idea on somebody else. And so what we see with so many of the unreliables and then also the biofuels is they want the ability to impose uh, these potentials on people, and they make these very sketchy arguments for them, but they're not required to actually demonstrate them in reality. And then they're demanding that, no, first we're going to ban the actual thing, and then don't worry, we'll make the potential work. And like, no, you won't, and no, you don't have a right to.